Hello everyone, welcome back. In the last lesson, we add a template for our login for my account component. And in this lesson, we'll try to add other two tabs. One is new account, the other one is forget password. So let's just go ahead and do that. And we'll have to add the empty tab here. We're gonna add another empty tab. And this one would be labeled new account. Save that. And it just come up, okay? But it doesn't have any content yet. Let's try to add it. And here we have a div, and the class would be alert info with ng if equals to email sent. And here we're gonna say something. An email has been sent to the email address you just registered. Please validate your email address and update your password info. Okay, so we have this alert info class, and basically this is just something for message displaying. Okay, and if you come back to our Bootstrap components and search for alert info, here you can see different type of alerts. There's some message like that, success, and alerts, warning, and error, something like that. Okay, so basically we are having the warning right now here. And after that, we're gonna have a form and just submit on new account. Form group. And let's see, we have label for new user name. Close the label. Username required and an NBSP. That's basically a space. And we have a span. Here, ng if username exists, style color red, username already exists, choose a different one. And then we'll have the input in a paragraph. So let's just copy from above. We're gonna paste it here. You have input as text, and this one would be new username, name equals to username, and this one would be just username. You don't want to have conflict on some of the, say, IDE and engine model the above. Okay, so autofocus, get rid of that. And here it says enter your username. Okay, now we're gonna have another from group this would be email address. So this variable would be email exists, email or exist. Please choose a different one. Oh, kind of making things simple, but input type email from control ID would be email. And here we're gonna say a valid email address. All emails from the system will be sent to this address. And we're gonna have a button. MD raised button type submit class met primary create new account. So this is our second tab. Let's go take a look. New account. Okay, that looks cool. And we have our third one. Forget password. So this would be something similar to that. So well, now we just copy and paste from above. Okay. So first we have our if. This one would be email not exists. So the error message would be email doesn't exist. Okay. And we're gonna have another div. And this one would be alert success, and nj equals to forget password email sent. Email sent. This one would be forget password. And here we just need one label for form group. This would be recover email. And we have your email address. And we don't need anything in between. Just delete everything until this input. The type would be email, class from control, ID would be recover email. Name would be recover email, and engine model would be recover email. Okay. And then we have a submit button. Here, let's change the text. Enter your registered address. And then we have the submit button. This one would be just submit. Okay. Let's take a look. Login, new account, forget password. Okay, that looks good. It's just the title, now it's not home, okay? So let's change it to something else. because we're at my account page, right? So we're gonna save my account. Alright, that looks good. And that's pretty much for this lesson. Alright, so in the next lesson we'll start to add the backend stuff so that the front end can talk to the backend. Okay, I'll see you guys in the next video.